If you have your Bibles, open up to the book of Esther, chapter 6 and chapter 7. And we are continuing our story through Esther in a message I have entitled, Sleepless Nights and Plans Foiled. And tonight we're going to be continuing that story that we have been following where Israel is under attack by a man named Haman. And Haman has put out a decree in the authority of the king to kill all of the Israelites or the Jewish people within under the rule of Persia at this time. And it has come down to a man named Mordecai and his adopted daughter, really his niece, named Esther, who had been made queen. And everything that we have been looking at in this story is building up to tonight's message. It's building up to this particular day. We're looking at chapter 6 and 7, but they all happen in one day. Everything is building to it, and everyone is playing their part. Esther is moving to the point where she is about to expose Haman and his evil deeds. Mordecai, her uncle and adopted father, has been standing his ground and taking up his identity as an Israelite and as a Jewish man and standing firm in that. Haman, the evil one, is being pushed forward by his pride and continuing to climb that pride level as he comes to the top. And then King Artaxerxes, well, he's just clueless. He has no idea all that is happening underneath his nose, and he's oblivious. And all of them are playing their parts perfectly, and everything is being weaved together into this perfect story of redemption that we're going to see. But just because they're all playing their parts, and just because God is not mentioned in this book of the Bible, doesn't mean that God is not at work. It is Him who is orchestrating everything together. And tonight we will begin to see His providence begin to shine out brighter than it has at any time in the book. It's much like in the movie or theater industry. Everybody points to the actor, right? Oh, that actor was so good in that movie. Did you see that actor? He did all this amazing work on set or on stage. It was so amazing and so good, right? We have award shows for the actor. Who shows up at the premieres? The actors do. They're the ones who everybody wants to see and wants to talk to. But the truth of the matter is, the actor may be good, but it is the director that is calling the shots. The actor looked great because the director maybe gave him a cue or came to him and gave him motivation to make that scene seem amazing. Maybe it was the director who cut out a bad scene or got rid of something that didn't make the actor look that great. Or maybe it was the director who took a failure in the actor's eyes and turned it into gold. You see, it is the director that is behind the scenes that makes the movie what it is. That is taking all of the parts, all of the individual things that the actor has done and putting them together to where you have a finished product. And that's exactly what God is doing here. You cannot leave God out of the book of Esther. You can't leave Him out of this story. And tonight we are going to see how His providence shines through and His deliverance is seen through a series of reversals. So let's get into our story tonight. We're going to walk through these two chapters verse by verse. So let's start in chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. It says, "That night sleep escaped the king, so that he ordered a book recording daily events to be brought and read to the king. They found a written report of how Mordecai had informed the kings of Bigtha and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the entrance, when they had planned to assassinate King Ahasuerus. The king inquired, what honor or special recognition was given to Mordecai for this act? The king's personal attendant replied, nothing has been done for him." So the first thing that I want us to look at tonight is this honoring of Mordecai that's about to take place. And we will see the providence of God. We will see the fingerprints of God in this passage right here. You can see that God is at work in the small things. There's 5 things that I want us to look at real quick. The first thing that I want us to look at is the fact that the king had a sleepless night. Now, this doesn't make sense. He's the king. He has a whole kingdom and a room full of servants that are taking care of him and making sure that he is comfortable and has a life of ease. If this was Esther or even Haman, as we'll see, you can understand. Esther's probably nervous that she's about to break this deal wide open in front of the king tomorrow and might be having a sleepless night. Haman may be so excited because he has planned that he is going to hang Mordecai on a gallows that is 75 feet high. And he might be so excited that he couldn't sleep. And in fact, we'll see he didn't. But yet the king, why couldn't the king sleep? Well, it was probably a fingerprint of God. A small thing that God allowed him not to be able to sleep. The next small thing that we see God do, the small miracle that he performs, is the choice of sleep aid. All right? This is the king of the most powerful kingdom in all of the world. He has servants waiting for him. He has 7 or 8 personal eunuchs that serve him. He could have had them bring him a glass of warm milk. He could have had some of them make him some tea or a sleep aid. He could have had the best musicians in the land come and play him a lullaby so that he could fall asleep. He had a palace full of concubines that he could have called and used them to help him fall asleep. But instead, he chooses to have a book read. He chooses to have his daily record read. And of all of the daily records that could have been read that particular night, they choose one from 5 years ago where Mordecai uncovered a plot to kill the king. Just another one of those small things that God was doing to bring deliverance. And as they read through this story and what is happening here, you see that Mordecai wasn't rewarded. And at the time you might think that's so unfair. Because we see that Mordecai saves the king, and in the very next scene that we have is that Haman, the evil guy, the bad guy in this story, is elevated to the prime minister, the right-hand guy to the king. And it's like, man, that seems unfair. That doesn't seem to make sense. But the truth of it is all of that happened, as we learned a few weeks ago, for such a time as this. Mordecai could have been upset or frustrated that the king didn't reward him, but as we're going to see, it was all in God's timing. All of these small things play into God's deliverance coming true. Now, the next small thing that God does is found in verses 4 through 9. So let's begin reading there. The king asked, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to ask the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's attendant answered, "Haman is there, standing in the court." "Have him enter," the king ordered, and Haman entered, and the king asked him, "What should be done for a man the king wants to honor?" Haman thought to himself, "Who is it that the king would want to honor more than me?" Haman told the king, "For the man the king wants to honor, have them bring a royal garment that the king himself has worn and a horse that the king himself has ridden, which has a royal crown on his head. Put the garment and the horse under the charge of one of the king's most noble officials. Have them clothe the man the king wants to honor and parade him on his horse through the city square, proclaiming to him, 'This is what was done for the man the king wants to honor.'" So what's happening here? What's the small thing that God brings about? Well, it's Haman's terrible timing. Here he comes to kill Mordecai and ask to kill Mordecai, the very man that the king is about to honor. And he shows up. But here's the deal. The timing, it's terrible for Haman, but it's perfect for God. Imagine if he would have gotten a good night's sleep and wouldn't have been excited and showed up 30 minutes, an hour, or 2 hours later. Maybe another official has come in and the king brings him in and asks him, hey, what should I do for a man that I want to honor? But Haman, in his excitement and wanting to have his day all planned out, and he had it planned out to the T. I'm going to go down early. I'm going to get in line to be one of the first people that the king sees when he comes into his court. I'm going to ask him to kill Haman. I'm going to go kill Haman, hang him on that stick. He'll be there all day. I'm going to go to lunch with the queen and the king, and everything's going to be awesome. And so he shows up there and he's very excited and he's all about like just planning out everything that's happening. And then the king comes to him and says, hey, why don't you come into my bedchamber? I got a question for you. Whoa, that's a step up on the level. So now he's walking back there and you know he's riding on cloud 9. And he is in such a good mood when he gets there and the king says, what should I do for a man I want to honor? He thinks it's him. And I love what he tells the king to do, right? What he tells the king to do shows his true colors. He wants to be king. He's sitting there thinking, okay, hey, I need to position myself. If I want to be honored, if I want to take the next step and not just be the number 2 guy, but be the number 1 guy, if I'm paraded in front of everybody as somebody the king wants to honor, if anything happens to the king, they're going to go, hey, what about that Haman guy? The king loved that guy. The king honored that guy. He was positioning himself to be king. And it's this pride that pressed. It's this pride that began the beginning of his downfall. Because you see, God was in charge of the little things. And he was making things happen to bring about deliverance, and Haman never noticed. And I think that's something that we oftentimes miss. So many times we ask God to come in and do a big miracle. God, I need you to come in with your big hand and scoop everything up and just make this amazing thing happen. And we're searching and we're looking so hard for that, we miss all of the little things that God is doing around us to provide an answer to our question. They didn't need all of this. They needed God to come in and say, hey, save us, save the people. But God had things in place. He was in control and was using the small things, the little miracles, to bring about deliverance. As you can imagine, Mordecai probably wasn't too happy. Let's look at what happens next. In verse 10 and 11, it says, then the king told Haman, hurry, do just as you proposed. Take the garments and the horse for Mordecai the Jew. Whew. I bet Haman's heart fell through the floor. Who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not leave anything out that you have suggested. So Haman took the garment and the horse. He clothed Mordecai and paraded him through the city square, crying out before him, this is what is done for the man that the king wants to honor. This is our first reversal of the night. Something that was supposed to happen that got changed and reversed in the opposite direction. Here is Mordecai who wants to be king. Here is Haman who wants to be king. He wanted and was upset at Mordecai because he wouldn't bow down and worship him as the king's official. He wanted that from Mordecai, but he hadn't got it. So he planned to kill him. And now what happens? He has to parade and worship Mordecai as a king in front of all of the people. The very thing he wanted Mordecai to do, he was now having to do for Mordecai. God begins to reverse things for the Israelite people. I mean, imagine for a second. People who had been destitute, who thought their lives were over, who thought everything was bad and death is coming. And now they see Mordecai, one of them, being paraded through the city. Hopes must have been perked just a little bit. But there's something else I want to point out that I think we often read over as we go through this. The king tells Haman, take the garment, take the horse for Mordecai the Jew. Now this is important because I think we miss a couple of things here. Number one, for the majority of the story, Mordecai had hidden his identity from everybody. But yet here we find out that the king knows that he is a Jew. So it has gotten back up to the king that Mordecai is a Jew. But it also tells us something else. The king either forgot or he didn't know that the edict Haman had asked for was against the Jewish people. If you remember back to that part of the story, the king never asked Haman, what people, what did they do wrong, who are they, how is it going to affect me? He just said, you do what you need to do. He had no clue that he was about to honor a man that he had already sentenced to death. Something was amiss. The king was unaware. The king was clueless. He didn't know that he had been deceived. Haman's reaction was what you would probably expect. It picks up in verse 12. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried off home, mournful and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all of his friends everything that had happened. His advisors, his wife Zeresh, said to him, since Mordecai is Jewish, you have begun to fall before him, and you won't overcome him, because your downfall is certain. And while they were speaking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and rushed Haman off to the banquet. You see, Haman's pride had led to this fall, and it wasn't over. This was only halfway, and it was going to continue. And his family and his friends, they even recognized it. His wife, who was a pagan, recognized, look, if you can't overcome Mordecai the Jewish man now, your destruction is already written in stone. Now there's one of two outcomes for this. The first outcome is part of their pagan religion, where they believed that signs in the beginning pointed to something at the end. So they saw their husband, their friend, go to try to kill Mordecai and come back, and he had to honor him. And they saw that and they went, whoa, if you couldn't overcome him there, something's going to get you in the end. The other option is they understood who the God of the Jews were, and that they knew he was no one to be trifled with, and that the end was coming for Haman. Maybe they didn't know how soon, but they had a realization, either way you look at it, that he was in trouble. Pride often comes before a fall. Pride often gets the best of us. And that's exactly what happened to Haman. But I love the contrast of Mordecai. Mordecai had just been paraded through the city square. Said a man that the king wants to honor. He was wearing a king's robe, riding a king's horse. He had a crown upon his head. And what happened when this was all done? Mordecai returned to the king's gate and continued working. He didn't buy into the pride. I mean, I know if it was me, I would have been in all types of trouble. I wouldn't have made it to the king's gate. I'm like, did you just see that? Did you just see what happened to me? This was awesome. The king honored me for something I did 5 years ago. What's going on with that? But who cares? Check me out. I'm the man. I don't know if he got to keep the king's robe or not, but I wouldn't have taken it off. I would have just kept wearing it. Yeah, But he didn't do that. He took off the garment and he went back to work. That is the humbleness that we need to live our lives with. Because too many times we serve our own pride or our own self-centeredness instead of remaining humble and relying on God. We move into chapter 7 now, and we reach the destruction of Haman. And it's been good so far, but it's about to get better. Haman had been humiliated. He went to kill a man and ended up honoring him. He went home and he whined about it. And before he could even compose himself, he is whisked away to dinner with the king and queen. It says in verse 7, or chapter 7, verses 1 through 7, it says, "The king and Haman came to the feast with Esther the queen. Once again, on the second day, while drinking wine, the king asked Esther, 'Queen Esther, whatever you ask will be given to you. Whatever you seek, even to half the kingdom will be done.' Queen Esther answered, 'If I have found favor in your eyes, your majesty, and if it pleases the king, spare my life, this is my request, and spare my people, this is my desire. For my people have been sold into destruction, death, and extermination. If we had merely been sold male and female slaves, I would have kept silent. Indeed, the trouble would not have been worth burdening the king.' King Ahasuerus spoke up and asked Queen Esther, 'Who is this? And where is the one who would deserve such a scheme?' Esther answered, 'The adversary and the enemy is the evil Haman.' Haman stood terrified before the king and queen. The king arose in anger and went from where they were drinking wine to the palace garden. Haman remained to beg the queen Esther for his life because he realized that the king was planning something terrible. God is in charge and uses small things to bring deliverance. Haman's timing was terrible, but Esther's timing was perfect. She waited to speak. Ecclesiastes tells us that there's a time to be silent, there's a time to speak. There's a time for peace, and there's a time for war. And Esther had been silent. She had remained in peace. She was not inactive. She was fasting and praying and asking for help. But she waited. She bided her time. She had 2 opportunities before this to deliver this message. And she waited for God to give her the okay. Her timing was perfect. Oftentimes I think that's something that we struggle with. We get so excited or so focused on what we think God has for us that we will run ahead of God's plan and get things out of order. We must sit back and be patient and wait on His timing. He tells us from time to time, yes. He tells us from time to time, no. And other times He tells us it's time to wait. And when we get that wait, we must be patient. We must wait to speak. We must wait to wage war. We must wait for the timing to be perfect. And we must prepare. Through prayer, through fasting, through education, through whatever it is that you feel God has planned for you in your life. You must prepare for those things so that you are ready for when the moment is right and He says yes, you can move forward. And that's exactly what Esther did. Esther, when the time was right, she had waited, she had prepared, everything was ready, and she spoke delicately and deliberately. She had a purpose, she had a plan, and she laid it out. She made it clear that she was dependent upon the king's favor. She wasn't in this to demand her action for her pleasure. She demanded it for the pleasure of the king. I am here in your favor, if it pleases you. She said, I'm dependent upon you and what your decision is. And then she reminded the king of the decree that he had made, the decree that he had allowed. She says, my people have been purchased or have been sold into destruction, death, and extermination. Now this is very clever, because if you remember, at this time, kings could not do anything wrong. Many kings throughout the world during this time period often had scapegoats along the side. And so she is very clever by what she says, because by saying that they were sold, it means that there was a purchaser and there was a buyer and a seller. And she was saying, look, you were the seller, but there's also a buyer. She's showing the king, this is kind of your fault in a very delicate way. But you're not the only one who was there. You were deceived. Things didn't go the way that you thought they were. She gave the king an out. And when the king asked her, who is this that has done this? I mean, first off, imagine his shock. Save my life. This is his queen. No one would dare threaten the queen's life in his mind. And she's saying, my life's in danger and my people are in danger. And then when he asks, who would dare threaten my king? She points at his most trusted advisor. The shock and awe that must have been running through him was unbearable. His anger flared and he stormed off, learning that his wife's life had been threatened, and it was by his most trusted advisor. He storms off. But Haman stays. He stays to beg for his life. And I love how verse 8 portrays it. It says, just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. And the king exclaimed, would he actually violate the queen while I am in the house? As soon as the statement left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Haman, whose one desire was to put fear into the heart of the Jewish people, to threaten them with death and hope to deliver upon it, who wanted them to bow and worship him as a king in fear, was now cowering before a Jewish woman pleading for his life. The second of our reversals. That's exactly what he wanted. He was now doing. Bowing before her, begging her. And the way that he did it is he started at her feet to beg, and he crawled up her legs and he laid himself across her. Some scholars say that in his mourning he may have even torn his clothes, which would give the appeal that he was trying to attack her. And he lays across her lap right as the king comes in and sees this and seals his fate. I mean, it was already done, but now he just drove in the last nail. And the king sees it, and immediately he is snatched away. Like a mob movie. Covered his head with a plastic bag and he gone. But his reversal was there. The story continues as we now get the verdict and the judgment upon Haman. Verses 9 and 10, the last two verses of our passage tonight. Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, there is a gallows 75 feet tall at Haman's house that he made for Mordecai. You know, the one who gave the report that saved the king's life. Smart guy. The king said, hang him on it. And the king hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Our third reversal, right? Third reversal of the evening of the passage. He had built a gallows 75 foot high for Mordecai, and now he himself was hanging on the gallows. What a way to go. Started the morning with such excitement and pride to end on the gallows you just oversaw being built. But there's something else I want to point out here. If you haven't picked up on it, there's a theme tonight. And it is God uses the small things. Harbona, a eunuch, one of the king's eunuchs. He's mentioned one other time in this book in chapter 1, verse 10. And it says that he's one of 8 eunuchs that personally serves the king. This guy has a lot of details on Mordecai, on Haman and Mordecai. Where did he get all of that information? Well, this isn't in the text, but I like to be a detective sometimes. And I'm going to tell you what I've deduced. You can judge for yourself whether it's right or wrong, but you'd be wrong if you think it's wrong. I don't know that. I'm just trying to be silly. Here's what I think happened. Harbona was a king's eunuch. He served the king, never left the king's side. So how in the world did he have all of this information? Here's how he had all the information. Earlier that morning, King Ahasuerus says, who's in the court? Harbona is the one who goes and looks. Haman's in there. Go get him and bring him to me. He goes and picks him up and brings him in. All right? This is my best Sherlock Holmes. Brings him in. On the way, we've learned something about Haman in this message tonight. This dude was on cloud 9. He was so excited, he got up early and came. So you better believe as they're walking back to the king's bedchamber, he's sitting there. Check this out, man. I'm so mad at this guy Haman that I came up with this awesome plan. I have built a gallows 75 foot high, and I'm going to ask the king today if I can hang him on it because this dude didn't like me. He didn't bow to me. He didn't worship me. And I'm so excited. This is going to be so good. And then I'm going to go to lunch with the queen and the king. And his pride got the best of him. And this eunuch's walking back going, whoop. Okay, yeah, let's see how that goes. And then time comes, and he sees how Haman has deceived the king. Maybe he's seen the whole thing unfold because he's been at the king's side the whole time. And when the time comes, he gives an awful lot of details. How did he know it was 75 feet? How did he know it was meant for Mordecai? He had to have heard it from Haman himself. God is in charge of the small things, and He will use them to bring about deliverance. And just like we learned last week, are you ready for such a time as this? Harbona was a eunuch that served the king. When the king said what to be done, this dude didn't hesitate. He goes, let me give it to you. So Haman is now gone. Everything's great, right? No. There's still a problem. The edict that Haman proclaimed is still out there. And the king can't do anything to change it. It's written in stone. He can't reverse it. And so next week you'll have to come and see how God reverses the curse. But before we get out of here tonight, I want to give one point of application. And I've debated whether to give it or not, and I've decided to go ahead and do. And that is this. We have to learn to remove the flesh. What do I mean by that? We mentioned a few weeks ago that Haman is a type or a typology here. And he is an image or a symbol of human flesh, like our fleshly nature. And within each and every one of us, there's a spiritual battle going on between our human flesh nature and our spiritual nature. And whichever one you feed will win out in the end. And Haman is a representative of that. He is a self-centered, carnal human being who is out for his best. And that is what our human nature is all about. And oftentimes it's not easy to spot our flesh on ourselves. I mean, the king learned that firsthand. It wasn't until Esther unmasked him that he saw that there was a problem with Haman. And many times for us, we have a hard time recognizing that flesh inside of us. We have a hard time recognizing that because it's the way we've always been. It's part of our nature. It's how we were born. And we look at ourselves and we find that, we get snappy at people from time to time. We get aggravated by people very easily. Our anger is a big problem. Our jealousy, our greed, our lust, our desire for sex and for relationships is taking over. And when people confront us on it, we're like, well, it's who I am. I'm not going to change. Because we think that's who we are. And oftentimes, many of us, we go, well, I've got rid of a lot of those. I got rid of pornography in my life. I got rid of my anger problems. I got rid of all of these things. But yet there's one thing that you still don't recognize. And you just keep it right here in your pocket. And it's like a pet to you. And it's something that you just, feed a little snack every once in a while. It's no big deal. No one's going to know about my sin. No one's going to know about my problem. I'm just going to let this little fleshly guy just kind of sit here. And it's no big deal, right? He's just hanging out. We're buds. No one's going to know. No one has to know. I got rid of all of those big things. But this little guy, he's going to hang here. And we are locked in to that fleshly desire. And it has us in bondage. And if you continue to feed that fleshly desire, it will win out in the end. Even if you're only giving it a little snack once a week or once a month, it's going to continue to grow. And we have to learn to remove the flesh. When Haman was announced and all that he had done to the king, he didn't say, all right, well, I'll forgive you, move on. No, he took him out and he hung him on a 75-foot pole. We have to get rid of our fleshly desires. We have to get rid of those fleshly things. It is not who we have to be. It may have been who we were born as, but it's not who we have to be. Scripture tells us that we no longer have to be ruled by our flesh or that one thing, that little pet that you have that you keep hidden from everybody else. It no longer has to rule your life or even be a part of your life. Because Jesus is on the throne. Your flesh isn't on the throne. Haman's not on the throne. He didn't even get to parade around on the horse. Christ is on the throne. And he got to that throne by being our creator. He helped to earn that throne by coming down and living the perfect life and dying for us to pay the penalty of our sin, to pay the penalty of all of those fleshly desires so that we could remove them, get rid of them, kill them, and move on and live a life in freedom. And if you can learn to accept Him and trust Him as your Savior, you no longer have to be a slave to your flesh. You no longer have to be tortured, deceived, lied to, that's the same thing, by your flesh, by the Hamans in your life. Sometimes it can be people, but most of the time it's just us. So I wonder tonight, how many of you are tired of living a fleshly life? How many of you are tired of dealing with the Haman in your life tonight? Let's bow